I'm Kyle Thompson.
I'm Bob Neubaur.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this week we are reading Platform Capitalism by Nick Srnicek, which was released, I think, in December of 2016. I like this book quite a bit. What was your take, Bob? Did you like it?
Yeah, I really liked it because I got into it because I was teaching a class on political economy of communications, and I had to convince, I had to fool the students into them thinking that I knew things about this stuff, and I couldn't, and I couldn't really find a really solid broad view of the platform sector and its relationship to capitalism over time. And when I read the book, I was just really impressed. It just seemed a lot more both grounded, expansive, but grounded and detailed than a lot of the other stuff I had seen written on platform media. And so I really liked it. I thought it was great.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. I think it's very interesting because in the sort of introduction to the book, Srnicek lays out kind of where he thinks the book falls compared to previous studies of the subject. But I think the thing that really impressed me is it's a very political economy focused, profit-driven picture of platform capitalism, of capitalism of digital platforms. But because of that, specificity, because it is focused on this, one subject, as opposed to, this broad-reaching, overall view of capitalism, which you usually get in political economy, it ends up being quite a bit more engaging. Because it's easy when you have, I find when you have a book that is so driven by that falling profit rate argument, it's easy to get just kind of oh yeah, it's more of the same, right? It's the same argument again. Of course it's the falling profit rate. It's oh, why is the sky blue? Oh, it's the falling profit rate, right? Kind of get into that sort of repetitious problem in some of this political economy stuff. But you really don't get that with this book. It feels much more engaged, much more detailed, much more textured. It's really quite an engaging read, and it feels given that it was written in 2016, it feels very prescient. It feels like the experiences that we've had, since then. That's my shower curtain crashing to the ground. The experiences we've had since then really bear out what Srnicek was saying in 2016. It feels like the direction things have moved is in line with what he was saying in this book, and it had some predictive value, and that's really impressive.
Yeah, totally. I mean, he's a clever guy, and he seems to have got it more or less right on the money with this one. I found it very, particularly for me, coming from a sort of tech startup kind of background, where these digital platforms are held in such high regard and are kind of held up as, these glimmering examples of a brand new paradigm, right? To then have the author here say that, you know what, not really, right? It's more of the same old shit. It's still just capitalism. We haven't transcended anything. It's not a sort of complete break from the past. And not only that, but it's actually a continuation of the past trends. That he roots this in a historical context and a continuation of trends that is very sobering, right? And it's kind of the opposite of the Silicon Valley take of ooh, gosh, look at these things, Uber is so shiny,
Yeah, I think he threads the needle pretty well there, because what he does is distinguishes platform capitalism from the previous neoliberal stage that people will be familiar with from reading David Harvey or whatever, as a new stage of basically in a kind of regulationist way. It's a new regime of production, right? It's still capitalism, but yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say at the same time, I think he does a really good job of connecting that of Harvey analysis or the kind of analysis of neoliberalism to platform to this new stage, like to this new regime, right? Because it's like, oh, okay, you've got like massive unemployment and precarious employment, and that makes Uber more attractive for people to work at. You've got declining savings and stagnating wages, especially for young people, and that makes Spotify very attractive. And so there's a real it doesn't just reinvent the wheel or tell the same old story, but it does connect the outcomes of those previous stories to the world we're living in now very well. I thought I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, it's an extension of that kind of like regulationist history, like anybody who's followed the political economy of this stuff is familiar with from like the last 40 years, right? It's like, oh, like I'm adding on to this story.
Yeah, it's good stuff. So if we dig into the introduction, we get this opening that like this is a book about the contemporary moment and its emerging technologies, right? We're talking about platforms, big data, advanced robotics, machine learning, the Internet of Things, all this sort of stuff, right? And the author identifies a shortcoming in a lot of the analysis of this stuff, right? That like it almost always leaves out the question of ownership, right? The kind of political economic relations that underpin all this stuff. So in this book, he's going to be analyzing emerging technology in a economic historical context, which is pretty novel, right? Like you don't often get this kind of analysis of this exact topic.
Yeah, he's specifically distinguishing it from the kind of like ideology critique that we saw in the Californian ideology and in All Watched Over. Though he's distinguishing it from that kind of analysis, and then also distinguishing it from autonomist analysis of digital capitalism, which I don't think we've really covered very much on this show, but is I guess very prominent in academic circles, even if it doesn't have much sway or popularity outside of them.
I would say, very prominent in media and communication studies in particular. Like I've noticed that where it's like the new people in my department getting hired are autonomous. The big books they're writing are based on the autonomous tradition. And when I started doing look at the job market and who's hiring, I looked at U of T's communications program and they had a job and I was like, oh, maybe since they got some Marxists, and I was like, oh, they've got 10 liberals and 6 autonomous, right? So it is very very prominent in that little subset of academia, and this is a bit of a refreshing departure from that for me.
Yeah, and given that we haven't really covered autonomism that much on this show, like we have certainly cast some shade in their direction in the xenofeminism episode, but I guess we should just kind of give a little rundown on what the sort of autonomous position is on this stuff, because again, it's just something the listeners might not be super familiar with. So I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Bob, because you've got more sort of personal familiarity with the scholars who do this kind of work. But I think autonomism is really focused on the idea of the general intellect and the social factory, right?
That's right.
So these are two concepts. Like general intellect, I think most people will be familiar with from our show. It's something that comes out of Marx's work. And the essential idea there is that as capitalism becomes more and more sophisticated, science specifically, and sort of common social knowledge becomes a greater and greater component of production. And I think we would all certainly agree with that. That's really not something that would be controversial at a time like this. But what the autonomists tend to do is they make the leap from that point to saying that, well, okay, if that's the case, then maybe kind of everything we do is productive of value.
everyone ends up producing value all of the time through their social relations, and you move away from an argument like, okay, like, you know, Nike might go into low income minority majority neighborhoods and steal their styles and appropriate them to everyone's slang, everyone's mode of sociability. Everything everyone is doing is somehow fueling value, and often I would argue that they don't show the math.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, yes. So, I mean, I think their take on the general intellect is very much tied to the idea of the social factory, which is kind of dissolving the distinction between productive and reproductive labor, right? Productive labor, which is productive of value in some kind of waged work relationship to a capitalist employer, and then work that is done to reproduce the worker, which is often unpaid. They try to kind of explode that distinction and say, well, it's all kind of productive of the capitalist system. And that's kind of also how their arguments about immaterial labor and informational capitalism kind of go, is like, let's just dissolve all of these conceptual distinctions and boundaries and think about capitalism as a productive totality. And so a lot of the debates about whether you agree with the autonomists or not is whether you're willing to draw distinctions between certain spheres of life, or whether you want to dissolve those.
And that it means that when it comes to analyzing platforms, they've been particularly interested, from my perspective, on advertising platforms and things in which they can describe as free labor, actually making a direct connection. It's kind of like a suturing between Negri's immaterial labor theory, and I would argue a reinvention of Dallas Smythe's audience commodity theory with like legacy media, right? Like audiences do labor by watching ads. Well, now everyone is doing labor by doing free labor by their Facebook posts, by sending emails on Gmail, and so you've got this vast apparatus which is acquiring that is fueling these industries, but it's all conceptualized as free labor, and Srnicek is critiquing that quite directly, but not spending lots of time on it too, which I think is nice. He kind of shows more than he tells, right?
It's a big upside of this this book, right? That it is pretty short, right? And even like I think the first chapter, right, the long downturn, is like for some, like it would be a thing you could just give to someone who wasn't familiar with, say, the history of the last 80 years or so in terms of economic development, and that would be a solid just 40-page intro that would cover the whole damn thing. You know, it's actually remarkable how dense it is and how readable. You know. Yeah,
definitely. So this is the point that you were getting to, Bob. But the point where the autonomist argument tends to fall apart is that they argue that sort of we're in this advanced stage of, you know, real subsumption where like everything is capitalism, and like capitalist value production is just off the charts, like, because everybody is constantly producing, you know, even to the point that like, you know, some people have argued that, you know, what were you saying earlier? Like that the production of value on the rate of profit on Facebook is infinite or something like that.
In fact, that is directly Christian Fuchs's argument, and I think maybe Terra Nova. I'm not sure. Those are the two most prominent people I know of specifically looking at social media. I feel like this just if someone looks at that, if your goal is praxis, which his is, right? If someone looks at that and says infinite rate of profit, oh, so I am more exploited in the rate of profit than a worker at a Foxconn factory, they're just going to laugh. Like, no one is going to take that seriously, and so it's just it becomes a bit of a problem because there's these kind of very grandiose gestures that don't seem to really meaningfully like engage with the kind of concrete way these platforms make profit and make money in a way that I think this book really does, because because he's not denying that people's activities on Facebook produce value. What he is denying is that everything that Facebook is using in terms of all the data it's getting can be meaningfully described as that type of labor, which he doesn't even think can be described as labor. And so it's that activity that helps fuel Facebook's profitability takes place in like an ever-growing and almost complex, increasingly complex matrix of activity being monitored by Facebook or whoever, or Amazon or Google, that can't meaningfully be described as people being forced to work long hours, which of course was like the classic argument that political economists had with Dallas Smythe and his original audience commodity theory back in the day. Like people like Graham Murdoch and so on, and Peter Golding used to have, I think, long and vicious arguments with guys like Dallas Smythe, right, about that. Because, of course, for one thing, people kind of like what they're doing a lot more than they like what they're doing at working at Starbucks. So
yeah, but that's I think Srnicek gets into that pretty concretely in chapter 2, but for the intro, one of the kind of opening points he sort of nails down is that the profit motive is what conditions everything in capitalism anyway, right? And it conditions these platforms too. So, like, we get a lot of this kind of stuff of like, Facebook need to have better values or whatever, or Google needs to have better values. And kind of the argument here is that that's kind of irrelevant because they're conditioned by this like abhorrent logic that like drives everything in the system, regardless of their values, right? Like he's recentering profit and competition as the objects of study here.
Yeah, it is like this is quite transparently a capital logic style argument. It like to the point that he even says, like in the introduction, like, yeah, I don't really talk very much about worker resistance or anything like that in this book. Basically responding to the sort of studies that autonomists tend to do when they're not making grand proclamations about, capitalism. He's saying, well, workers are so beaten down that it makes sense to focus on capital logic right now.
Yeah, because for now, capital is the agent of history.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Capital is the agent of this account at the very least, right? Like it is absolutely focused on the declining rate of profit, and it is absolutely focused on inter-capitalist competition more than it is focused on capitalist worker class struggle. So those are sort of like caveats that he provides at the beginning of the text. But like, given that other people have not been providing this analysis, I find it to be incredibly useful. And as I said, it does have sort of more texture and nuance and interest than some declining profit rate arguments do have.
Well, like if you read Robert, sometimes you feel it feels like you are following him, Roberts and Kleiman, or you feel like you're following them, exploring the implications of the theory in a way that's very similar to the autonomous stuff. Whereas this feels a little bit like, and maybe this is just a sleight of hand of Srnicek, but it feels like you're following him. Just following the money, like following the growth of these companies, following the monetary policy conditions, and finance the state and the conditions within the state finance nexus that make these companies possible at particular times. And it just feels refreshing. I feel like I learned so much each page.
Yeah, it's like that particular historical detail that really sets this book apart. But as we were saying, like the autonomist argument kind of falls apart on the basis of like this profit problem, and where you specifically see that is like if the rate of profit at Facebook is infinite, why was there a 2008 financial crisis? Why has capitalism been in the doldrums ever since then? Why is there a crisis of profitability in China right now that is like obvious and is provoking like clear state action to repress any kind of worker resistance, right? Like, these are important questions, and the autonomists have no good answers to them.
Mm-hmm. And I feel as well that we should point out, because I think it's something that we're carrying around implicitly that the listeners aren't aware of. This is Nick Srnicek of the Accelerate Manifesto with Alex Williams. So there's a lot of rhyming here and a lot of resonance with that work as well, and a lot of the same sort of ideas of like, yeah, capitalism is in this like sclerotic kind of calcified state. It's not actually as dynamic as it pretends to be, and so on.
Which really comes out of the analysis of Uber.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh,
like,
yeah.
This is not like, I feel like this is one of those books where I actually feel like I've got these like Friedman worshipping relatives. Like kind of like sort of corporate folks and finance folks, and I just feel like, and some of them just worship Zuck, and they love the word disruption. It's the most exciting word to them in the world, and I feel like you could give them this book and they'd be able to read it, like they'd be able to, whether they agreed or not, it wouldn't seem like it wouldn't seem magical. It would seem pretty grounded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. But anyway, Nick wraps up the end of the introduction with kind of like setting out the tone of what's coming. But like the argument of this book is that with a long decline in manufacturing profitability, capitalism has turned to data as one way of maintaining economic growth and vitality in the face of a sluggish production sector. So yeah, just like what we're on about there, like capitalism is in a kind of dire straits, really, but this is like one of the last resorts, right, to maintain any kind of dynamism is to turn to like hoovering up data and trying to weaponize that.
Yes, and he's going to give a very specific definition of what data is.
Yeah.
And what it's not.
Right. Yeah, and the and what the generation and processing of it really implies for labor.
A data economy is not necessarily a knowledge economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's definitely deflating a lot of that sort of 90s knowledge economy, whiz bang, new economy sort of stuff. But anyway, Chapter 1, The Long Downturn, gives us a bit of a history of what's come before, leading up to this moment with these platforms. And I figure, Kyle, you're our history of economics guy. Could you give us like a whistle-stop tour of this chapter?
Yeah, sure. So I think this is a story some of our listeners may already be familiar with to some extent. If you want to look at it from kind of like a history of economics or economic history perspective, as I said, it's really focused on the falling profit rate. So the argument here is that you have this period of dynamism in the aftermath of World War II, where you have America simply like without any kind of industrial rivals because the other ones have been bombed into oblivion. And that creates a very strong possibility for rising profitability. And this leads to rising standard of living. It leads to sort of the golden era of the welfare state. I mean, again, this is a profit-driven analysis, so you can point to like how workers actually fought for those things and all the specifics of how that played out.
And racialized and gendered divisions of labor and how those also fall apart in the 60s. Like that's stuff you don't really get from this sort of analysis. Admittedly.
Right,
where
exactly.
Admittedly, I think the autonomists are stronger on that.
Right, and it is. So that there are a lot of gaps in that history, but the basic point here is that the high rate of profit and the sort of uncontested dominance of the United States in this period, alongside the sort of comparative advantages that Germany and Japan had as like low-cost producers with like a very strong educated workforce and so on, it led to this real boom of capitalism, and it definitely changed people's minds about capitalism. People, it kind of, prior to that, they'd been through the Depression, and they were sort of more in a mindset similar to the one that we have today, where we see capitalism as kind of a declining system, a system that's had its day in the sun, but that day is gone. And their minds were turned around in the 50s and 60s into the early 70s because there was this period of welfare capitalism. I think it's called often called Fordist sometimes called like institutionalized or something like that.
Sometimes called organized capitalism. I think the monthly Review School of monopoly capitalism is a similar thing. Although they trace the rise of monopoly capitalism to earlier than the Fordist period, but yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, this is a significant period in the history of capitalism, and in the 1970s. You get stagflation, you get the breakdown of Keynesianism as their understanding of the economy increasingly has less and less to do with reality, and they don't know how to manage the economy in an effective way that is going to ensure full employment at the same time as it ensures low inflation. And so the decision is made. And the reason why this happens specifically is because Japan and Germany become more and more competitive. Their economies become more sophisticated. They have newer vintages of the means of production. They have newer machines. They have newer factories. They have better production processes than America does. And in a competitive market, American capital becomes less and less competitive. And prices are driven down towards costs. Profitability collapses, and the response to that is to restructure capitalism in the form that we are familiar with as neoliberalism. And that involves creating more flexible production systems. It involves focusing on core competencies in the business instead of having these sprawling corporate enterprises.
Companies become lean.
Yeah, you get lean production, you get just-in-time production where you don't have big inventories sitting around, you don't have labor forces that you need just in case there's a surge in demand.
You outsource to mitigate to only be working in your core competencies, right? And our outsourcing rapidly turns to offshoring by the 90s. Yeah.
Yes, and specifically, it also involves smashing unions, driving wages down in absolute terms sometimes, but often through using central banks to implement really draconian monetary policies,
like the Volcker shock.
Yeah, and that all basically leads to smashing the power of the union, smashing the power of the workers, and trying to extract value by just making everybody work harder for less.
Yeah, and brutal attacks on the social wage as part of that union and labor busting movement, right? You don't just have to destroy people's worker protections. You've got to make sure that they're more dependent on the market than ever.
Now, so this is a very common story. Most people understand that story from sort of Bernie's rhetoric or something like that, right? There is a strain of American progressivism that, or of social democratic arguments that kind of point to all this stuff. The specific thing that's different about the account that Srnicek is giving is that this is a profit-driven phenomenon. So the decisions that were made in the 70s were draconian and horrible, but they were absolutely rational in terms of the profit motive and the necessity of profit to capitalists, the perpetuation of the capitalist system. And so what that means is neoliberalism didn't happen because Reagan and Thatcher were mean people. It didn't happen because of an ideological shift. It happened because of a clear motivation in the logic of capital. That is all about the falling rate of profit as you get improved technology coming in and old vintages become less and less competitive. And it's also about offshoring, internationalization, the collapse of communism leading to a glut of labor and poor labor conditions around the world. So when we look at social democratic politics today or progressive politics today, we have to reckon with the actual demands of capitalism as a profit-seeking system. We can't just think about this in terms of ideology or kind of voluntaristic theories of if we just had more spirit if we just fought harder, if we just struggled harder, then everything could be like it was in the 50s. Everything could be like it was in the 60s. And like, you know, obviously there are massive problems with 50s and 60s that are often obscured in that account, but it is a popular account, and it is an account that these kinds of profit rate focused historical arguments don't really share anything in common with, because, you know, they're just going to say, well, if you fight the profit motive hard enough, there's going to be a big backlash, and what are you going to do about it? It's not something you can just kind of freely change here and there.
Yeah. And that brings us up to the track from the 70s towards the dot-com boom and bust, right? Where, because manufacturing profitability slumped, the money goes on the hunt for new investments, right? Because even though the profitability is gone, the profitability imperative is still there. So you end up with like big chunks of money just kind of roaming the world looking for places to find new returns. And that becomes venture capital funding, and all gets poured into the new internet infrastructure, right? Like, it's a frenzied rush to dominate the brand new shiny internet market in the hopes of creating giant cyber monopolies. You know, it's this big go big or go bust, the winner take all sort of thing. And yeah, what's interesting there, and I'm kind of rhyming with what we've been saying, but like if for the Silicon Valley crowd and for tech startup people, I mean, everyone I've been familiar with, like, this is just taken as a given, right? Oh, you know, one day a big load of money showed up, and then internet, and then nice things, right? But Srnicek is drawing a direct line here. There's a through line all the way through this history. There's an arc to it all, and each new development follows on from the previous one in a very kind of sensible kind of way, or, well, sensible in retrospect, right? Like, history is this weird thing where it's hard to predict, but looking back on it, it all sort of makes sense and rhymes. So yeah, we get this huge injection of capital into the fixed assets of the internet, and the internet goes mainstream. You know, California lights up. It's the new best place to be. Which enables more outsourcing, right? Because now you've got the network technologies to further that trajectory.
Yeah, as we talked about in that Graeber episode on the flying cars and flying rate of profit, a lot of these technologies began as efforts to discipline the workforce and to increase profitability by de-skilling and disempowering them. And thereby, you know, creating more opportunities to have lower wages and so on. And so, yeah, it really starts out of there and then kind of blossoms out into its own whole sector of capitalism.
That's right, and of course that boom is associated, like, this fixed infrastructure. Like, you know, you're seeing this period of massive layout, a rollout of fiber optic cables, transatlantic submarine cables, which are obviously significantly designed to stitch together a transnational mode of economic organization that can discipline labor on a global scale, that can coordinate finance in a rapidly burgeoning. This is the same period of the repeal of Glass-Steagall. This is the same period of a massive increase in financialization. But of course, by the end of the bust, you've now got this massive capacity for firms that actually weren't profitable to do this, right? Like, I think that's a recurring theme of, like, the state finance nexus, the cheap money from state finance nexus during crisis of profitability. It continuously becomes necessary for organizations to actually lay a lot of unprofitable groundwork. Like, it's not like these people just had such brilliant ideas that the market immediately rewarded them. I actually think one of the narratives that comes through with this is like, well, why not just socialize this shit from the start?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Well, yeah,
none of this shit is profitable. I find students pick up on that. Like, they like that a lot more than the free labor argument. Anyway, sorry,
yeah, it's a great argument. It's a very sensible argument. Because you know, like, in the case of something like Amazon's
not profitable for 10 years. Google's not profitable for 10 years. You got to give them monopoly status, and then they'll fuck you over the data. Like, why didn't we just build this shit?
Yeah, exactly. And like in the case of Amazon, you know, it's like their great hack was to exploit a loophole in the USPS, right? And the USPS, that's some old infrastructure, right? Like, that's infrastructure that's been going back a long time. And then on top of that, you have the 90s fiber optic infrastructure that they're taking advantage of, and the software infrastructure that was developed in that time. And so, like, these often directly state financed, but sometimes state financed through like central banking policy efforts are essential to the construction, development, and survival of these industries. The result is wages continue to stagnate, right? We have more and more billionaires. We have these tech billionaires who are just like the robber barons of our time, and they have entirely done this, on the back of massive public financing and long periods of unprofitability, which, really points to the unfairness of this whole thing, because if you went to start a small business and you said to your banker, I might be profitable in 20 years, there's no way you are going to get loan for your small business plan. But that's what these people have done and become the richest people on earth because of it.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. It's like no mom and pop operation would be treated with this level of largesse from the state finance nexus as these platform capitalists were. Like the extent to which this involves a massive social transfer of wealth. Really, right, and to a certain extent, this whole history of this book, the 1990s, the post-2008 crisis, it feels like a constant series of monetary policy, loose monetary policy, and the finance nexus pushing on a rope.
Yeah, totally. Which is kind of what happens with the 98 with the East Asian crisis and how that we covered a lot of that in the All Watched Over episode as well. But as you were saying, we get in order to keep the show going, right? We get all this financial chicanery, cutting interest rates and all this kind of shit. I think the phrase that's used here is asset price Keynesianism as well. Which
very much the Paul Krugman school of Keynesian thought.
That just creates another round of roaming money, or like you could just imagine a big tidal wave of predatory money that's just washing around the globe, just seeking anywhere that it can find a return. And that goes into housing, which we all know leads to the fucking 2008 crisis, right? That shit bursts.
And it's every round of this that happens, the monetary policy becomes more and more desperate and exotic and just strange, right?
Yeah, until you end up with quantitative easing, right?
Yeah, and that is one thing I really like about what Srnicek does in this book is that he investigates and highlights the ways in which quantitative easing has enabled cash hoarding by tech companies, and how that has this really negative synergy with their capacity for tax evasion. So you have essentially this isn't something Srnicek goes into, but essentially I think maybe Wendy brought this up when she was on the show. I can't remember, but as these tech companies start to hoard more and more money, they essentially begin to become more and more financialized, and they become more and more like investment companies. Until you get something like Alphabet, right? Google.
Totally.
Google becomes very abstracted from its original core business competency, and so they start to participate in all of the worst results of quantitative easing in terms of speculative investment and so on, asset inflation. In addition to their already existing practices of tax evasion. So they're causing more and more social harm and paying less and less into the social fund.
Yeah. Well, and if you've got a shit ton of money just sitting out there in big pools in the British Virgin Islands or whatever, the Cayman Islands, then all of a sudden, and you've got effectively zero or negative interest rates, it's actually cheaper for you to go into more debt than it is to repatriate your cash and pay the tax.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Which ties in with this kind of post 2008 bit as well, where like obviously the massive bills that states were left with led to our austerity policies that came after. But that's then exacerbated. Like there's a vicious cycle here where they're hoarding all this wealth instead of, like, say, you know, paying tax on it or whatever, and that exacerbates the austerity. And then, like, there's this whole thing as well where, like, you know, the monetary policy becomes the only lever that you have because you can't spend, you know, like as a state, right? Like, and this just goes around and around in a circle, and it creates increasing precarity for workers, right? Like for the general public, and also these gigantic fucking islands of money that are still trapped in that cycle of wanting to find, because like the imperative is still there, right? The imperative to, you know, go from money to commodity to money plus is still there, right? So it still needs to find something to do when it's not sitting still, right? So it's going into these immensely risky assets and risky investments because the real economy, you know, to put it in quotes, is dead in its ass, right? Like it's just there's no profit. The rate of profit, the actual rate of profit, has dropped to almost zero. So you're just left with this sort of vortex of bullshit, right? Like that just keeps on going and keeps on spinning and getting worse and getting crazier and crazier by the year.
It's an infinity spiral of bullshit.
Exactly.
Next stop, Superland.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, you know, but I find one thing that's interesting about this argument, and we'll get back to it when we get to talk about the lean platforms, is one thing I always point out to like the students who want Uber. I'm just like, you gotta understand, like the whole point of this is some of these companies aren't profitable. Like Uber doesn't make money. Like Uber's goal is to get enough venture capital and excess profits from the big tech giants that they crush the cab unions in whatever city you live in, and then they'll screw you and jack up the price. And then, like, their eyes open. Their eyes open. They're like, oh, my God, this is a bad deal. I'm like, well, yeah, don't listen to Thomas Friedman. Like, don't listen to this is the play. And that was Amazon's play, and that was Google's play, and that was Facebook's play.
Well, like, I think that's really interesting because, like, that Friedmanite shit is, like, it's the kind of stuff that makes sense so long as you never think about it. But then when you
know very much about it.
But when you say that to a student or just anyone, almost like they instantly get it and they're like, oh God, that's terrible, you know. Like it doesn't take much to flip them over there, you know.
People know a grift when you explain it.
Exactly.
Yeah. I have a friend Matt who claims we live in the current age of capitalism and actually grift capitalism.
Yeah, but you can definitely see that, right, with Trump and all his fucking weird like sharp-toothed grifters that like just hang around him, right?
Well, I mean, I always take issue with those kinds of characterizations because it like they always kind of harken back to a golden age of capitalism that didn't exist.
That wasn't a grift. It was always
right. Yeah. And like it kind of gets into the problematics of like the crony capitalism label.
That's right. No, and to be clear, this person who coined this phrase, it was a very jokey. I don't think it wasn't his real analysis that there was a golden period.
Yeah. I mean, like I definitely see how that argument like has some validity. It's just, you know, we always got to be like careful because I feel like at any possible opportunity, like the like liberal centrist spin machine will come up with like sort of qualifiers on the term capitalism that will allow them to situate like the good kind of capitalism against the bad kind of capitalism. We see this a lot with like the kinds of like spin doctoring bullshit that's happening in like the Democratic primary right now.
You're saying you are not voting for Beto O'Rourke?
I'm doing whatever the opposite.
Well, I was going to immigrate to the U.S. just so I could get on the Beto train, but you've convinced me, Bob. You've convinced me.
Yeah, at least find a way to publish more of his high school poetry.
Mm-hmm. that was fucking grim. Yeah. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, what we've got there is it's setting us up for the post-2008 moment, right? Like, and that's where we get into chapter 2 with platform capitalism. The opening remark is that, like, yeah, in crisis, capitalism tends to restructure and change, right? Like, and like, there's been changes all along this history that we've just seen, and there has also been a change post-2008 as well. And we've got, like, I mean, we're all familiar with this, right? The shift to, like, big data, automation, all these, like, on-demand platforms and all this kind of stuff. And he sort of sets it up like this is commonly understood as like this kind of new economy or knowledge economy stuff where like labor and product are immaterial and it's something new and effervescent. But no, it still just is capitalism, right?
And the commodity is not immaterial.
No, of course not.
Do you know, the amount of water that goes into to Google and Facebook's and the fucking NSA's servers? Like, this is not an immaterial product, and the labor that produces it is not immaterial. Like, it's a silly.
Yeah, like I was chatting with you about this like basically this streaming game service that Google's proposing to launch, or the one that Nvidia is already doing right now. And I definitely had a moment in thinking about this stuff of like looking at the little tiny box on my entertainment system and being like, oh man, it's so small and it uses so little power. And I was like, wait a minute, there's just a giant server farm on the other end that's using just as much power as it ever did, right? Like there's a sort of sleight of hand that happens with this stuff where like because you don't see the server farms, you assume it doesn't exist. It's very like classic commodity fetishism, right?
Yeah. And I mean like it's this the kind of the argument here then is that like I mean data is a raw material really, right? Like and it's like in the classic old capitalist process, right? Like material inputs are combined with labor to produce more stuff, right? Like this is still a material process. It's not something kind of weird and different.
And someone is working on that data, or someone is working on the algorithm which works on that data.
Yeah, I mean, it's thought of as lumber, right? That like it's a raw material that feeds into some process. And I mean, even if it's a skilled process, such as AI programmer, that's still a labor process that's acting on a raw material.
Yeah, and sort of Srnicek encourages us to think about like not just the person interacting with the Facebook UI as a source of data, but also like the vast array of sensors and lines and power systems and like all of these different points for collecting data that are much less human and much more familiar to us in kind of like the way we usually think about in industry, right? Like this kind of like big industry picture, that's also a part of the data story, right? And like the fact that Amazon and Google are trying to crowd your house with sensors absolutely everywhere does not mean that like those sensors don't exist, right? Like this is like an extractive process that has many different angles to it, and isn't just about the individual interacting with the abstract concept of the corporation.
Yeah, and it gives me a real, almost, maybe this is the wrong person, but it gives you a real like almost like Luxembourg feel. Like a kind of like capital, has to constantly expand geographically, and it constantly has to expand intensively. And Harvey picks up on that in his work, right? He was saying like, okay, like neoliberalism doesn't just involve smashing labor; it involves commodifying more and more aspects of life. And now it's like the number of steps you take on your run, right? Like the temperature in your fridge, right? The ways, like the times that you cook and you don't cook with your, like, it's everything. When I bought a new TV, the very first thing my smart TV asked, because I didn't realize, because I'm an idiot, and I didn't realize that Fire was Amazon, they were just like, can Alexis or whatever the hell listen to every single thing that you're saying at all times, even when the TV's off? And that was the first thing I did. I clicked no, and then I disconnected it from the internet, and my smart TV is now a dumb TV with excellent resolution. Which again, Srnicek mentions, people may find some of these products useful, but they're not clamoring for them. No one clamored for smart TVs. No one clamored for smartwatches. There was no massive design. But if I go into Best Buy now, I can't find a dumb TV with 4K, because they're going to bundle 4K with their sensors.
That's right.
And they're going to integrate into their platform, and it is the carrot.
And the other thing to think about is that these corporations are massively subsidizing all of these sensor products, right? Like the connected home, Internet of Things, all of that stuff is massively subsidized because people will not go out and buy it themselves unless it's subsidized.
Well, yeah, I mean, your Amazon, whatever the fuck it is, the little cylinder, it's like $10 or whatever, but that would be like 50 or 100 or whatever if it was on its own, and you wouldn't do it because it's like a fucking stupid idea. Same with the smart TV stuff.
And it drives home the necessity of needing a monopoly to begin with to get those network effects, and which then once again brings you back to the fact that you need a state finance nexus that will flood these guys with cheap money that the average person or the petit bourgeois person or the average worker will never get access to. And I just love the way all this just explodes the cult of personality of like the great Zuckerberg of history thesis, right? Like the great Zuck of history.
Yeah, but that's the head that's being built to here is that because data is the new hot raw material. It converges on this new business model essentially, which is the platform, which is all about extracting and hoarding data. Right, it's everything it does, and it usually does this by becoming platform is a thing where it's getting in the middle of two groups, right, like buyers and sellers, and is building the platform on which they'll interact. Such as Spotify, right, is a platform that hooks up like music listeners to music producers or to record labels. Uber is a platform that brings together people who want a car ride and people who are willing to give it, this sort of thing. And they're inserting themselves as middlemen into everything and then recording everything that happens. And as we've alluded to, like, network effects are a big part of this, right? Like the positive feedback loop of the more friends you have on Facebook or whatever, the more valuable the platform is. The more drivers are available on Uber, and the more users that are available. That's a sort of virtuous cycle or a feedback loop that goes around and round in itself, which becomes this kind of like tendency towards monopoly and a kind of winner take all kind of thing. So
yeah, and there is a point that Srnicek adds there that I think is also important, which is that having that monopoly position, having that really strong network effect working to your advantage, is also the way in which you are able to get new kinds of data that are not part of your core competency, right? Because in platform capitalism, that neoliberal drive to cut down to core competencies is completely exploded. And because of the desire to collect every kind of data you possibly can, these companies tend to balloon out and proliferate in all kinds of different competencies because they just want more points of contact with the world they can extract data from. And so you get something like Google expanding from Maps expanding into having like car navigation systems because like they didn't previously have access to that data necessarily, right? But because they already had the map data, they could make the argument that this is a useful system. And then drivers will use that system, which expands their data set more and which allows for the next stage of data expansion.
Mm-hmm. It becomes like a sort of expanding nanite swarm or like the flesh blob at the end of Akira that just like expands. And takes over everything in its path. Yeah.
Yeah, Tetsuo is capitalism. Totally.
Yeah. But the next section then brings us on to basically 5 types of platforms. He breaks it down as advertising platforms, cloud platforms, industrial, product, and lean. Which I think there's a lot of good stuff in here, which we won't get into absolutely everything, but we'll touch on the important points. The advertising platforms came out of the .com boom and bust, right? Just basically think Google, essentially. Where like after they were doing this thing where like they were unprofitable during the boom, right? And then when everything went bust, the handful of survivors needed to get revenue immediately to stay alive. So Google starts running ads basically.
Yeah, well, and there's an interesting point that Srnicek makes about these advertising platforms, which is that like in the boom period, there were a plethora of different strategies for profit seeking, but the companies in this era tended to land on advertising because they were sort of already like having to focus so much energy on pitching their product that they kind of already had this like expertise as hucksters and ad people, right? Yep. And so like that was sort of the reason why this like after like, you know, where like in the bubble in the tech bubble economy where everything was just like vapid bullshit and everybody was just spinning stories, that sort of expertise kind of like in the bust ended up serving them well in getting into advertising. Yeah, it's pretty funny. Yeah.
Srnicek gets a bit here into the sort of relation to this and like the Web 2.0 era and the whole thing about user-generated content. I think this is something we touched on a bit earlier with the autonomous stuff, right? That like we get this common account that this is like exploiting free labor, right? But it's really not, right? Because he has a much more rigorously Marxian kind of take on labor here.
Yeah, it's similar to the critique of the sort of expansive use of the term emotional labor, right? Where it's like, no, labor is like a thing that is proper to the relation between the capitalist and the worker. Things outside of that, they don't produce value. They shouldn't be considered.
Yeah, in the technical sense of value,
they don't produce capitalist value, right? Like it's not value that can be realized as profit, right?
Well, and it also becomes more politically generative, I would argue, because at the point where it's like you say that everything people doing outside of their working hours that they often enjoy doing is exploitative labor, then why resist that? Right, like my students never get that. Like they're just like in their eyes. Well, then it's I guess working for capitalism is great because I love posting these dank memes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love these dank memes. Like, why don't take is socialism going to take my dank memes away? Like, no, it's not where, you know.
Like, crucially, your dank memes and your messages to friends and stuff on WhatsApp, they're not created for exchange. Firstly, and if they were, that process would be disciplined by the usual capitalist imperatives to do more and do it more efficiently. And I have no intention of like sending fucking stupid pictures to my friends more efficiently. So it can't be labor, really, like realistically.
I think what people confuse is the way in which the lack of access to the means of production and the inherent precarity of being proletarianized causes us to use whatever means we have available to sort of like rationalize our lives and make them more profit producing. They confuse that with like anything we do outside of work as a whole, right? Like that general motive is not the same as engaging in actual like salaried or waged work.
Yeah, that's right. And also that the means of social reproduction, including your own entertainment, are increasingly commodified. And I think that is a blurring line that autonomous exploit for theory that I don't think actually really explains what they're looking at, right? Like so it's like on one hand, yeah, your social reproduction is increasingly happening on activity on platforms owned by companies that are profiting from your use of that. But that does not in and of itself means that you are laboring for those companies in a productive sense. I mean, I know a guy, I think Kyle, you knew him too, and he was, Kyle and I used to go in the same grad program, named Rob Prey, who he was always arguing against people like folks saying that this is a lot more like rent. You know, and I think that analysis is a little bit closer, not quite the same, but a little bit closer than Srnicek's.
Yeah, it's a sort of a third option that's not really discussed in this book very much, where it's like, you know, you have that idea of free labor, you have the idea of these firms as rent collectors, which I think is definitely valid, and then there's this third idea that Srnicek is introducing in this book, which is that you know, these firms are firms that collect and work upon data as a raw material.
And like data is produced by your so like sending messages to your friends, right? Like, but like that's the thing is the social interaction produces this residue that is a wonderful raw material for these companies, and that's why you're being like you're not being drawn into the platform to be exploited as such. You're being drawn in so they can scrape the data off of you. You know, like the residue of your interactions,
which is a delightfully gross image, by the way.
Yeah,
I'm thinking of Mark Zuckerberg with a little squeegee, and he's just kind of scraping the data grime off.
Well, it's literally the phrase that's used. Right?
It is like literally.
But I did want to just offer some clarification for our listeners because I think a lot of people may not be familiar with the sort of economics use of the term rent. So what we're familiar with is rent as like apartment rent, right? You pay your rent, but the term rent in economics basically refers to just any income you can derive from having ownership of a thing without actually putting any like productive use into having it, right? So when your landlord owns your apartment and you're paying them your rent, they are collecting a rent in the economic sense. But it can also be a thing like, say, a country has control of the land where a bunch of valuable natural resources. They can collect a rent because they have access to that scarce resource, right? Like they can control that land. Other people can't. So if they want the thing that is valuable, like oil or gold or whatever, they're going to have to pay a little extra on top of it. And that's the rent. And so usually in the argument about informational capitalism, it's like, monopoly power. It's having control of infrastructure. That's the sort of thing these tech companies are able to get rent from. Which I think is totally true. Like they do that. It's just this kind of gives us a more production focused as opposed to like distribution focused picture of how capitalism works.
Yeah, totally. So that's our ad platforms. The next one, which is a pretty big category actually, is the cloud platforms. So we're talking like Amazon AWS and like Google Cloud and stuff like that. Basically like renting out compute power. And renting out their internal platforms to other firms. So we're like software infrastructure, machine learning infrastructure, data stores. Any programmer in this era will be familiar with these because it's how we deploy our stuff now, basically. And it's the outsourcing of IT taken to the next level, right? And it's particularly kind of like it's becoming the compute infrastructure is becoming this basic means of production that like every business needs. Even like your sort of local bagel shop needs a sort of cloud hosted way of taking payments and stuff, even if it's like a completely independent vendor otherwise. Like it's even if you're not directly involved in computing, like your business touches this in some way, and it's an entirely private utility essentially, right? Like completely privatized.
Yes. Yeah, that's quite right.
Would retail's reliance on outsourced, just so I can be clear, would retail's reliance on like outsourced digital transaction technology be similar to this? Like there's like a handful of oligopolistic companies that run different debit card or Interact machines, right? And
like Stripe or whatever. Like that is an example of this kind of company.
But even then, like Stripe run all of their stuff on AWS, so like there's 2 layers of platform bullshit going on there.
Okay. 2 layers. It's platforms all the way down.
Yeah, exactly. And the sort of interesting historical point that Srnicek brings out here is that these kinds of cloud technologies usually developed out of like the internal logistical processes of these tech companies. So like AWS was originally a technology developed inside Amazon so the different divisions of Amazon could spin up new services easily. And then they were like, wait a minute, other people might want to use this too because we have times when we're not using it. So why don't we use the extra like free time on our servers and sell that to somebody else. And then boom, it starts to blow up and it becomes this entirely new form of profit collecting and production in the cloud area, right?
Yeah. And it rhymes as well with the next, the one, like the industrial platforms, which is the kind of industrial Internet of Things and like internetified manufacturing. I hadn't really been aware of this before, but like it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with consumers, right? Like with individual consumers, and so it's like very little known outside of like probably like specialist industry journals and that kind of stuff. But like the really interesting point that Srnicek brought up here was like GE's natural gas sensor apparatus alone collects more data than Facebook.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That is
amazing. Yeah. And so like this, like, you know, there is that whole like way in which digital capitalism tends to be thought of as very consumer focused and like individual consumers. But this really gets at that aspect of platforms and digital capitalism that sort of harkens back to the origins of tech in trying to rationalize industrial production in order to increase profitability. And the other thing they brought up here is that these industrial platforms are trying to branch out into the consumer space. Right, they're trying to make it so that the like capital volume 2 like realization process is smoother for these firms, which is basically that you can smooth out that line from the point of production to the point of consumption, and even from the point of consumption to like the point of like inventing a new product. Right, basically trying to create digital linkages between every part of the circulation process that will make things smoother and will improve profitability for, you know, large corporations.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's a good section. I mean, we're skipping a lot of detail here, but like, I mean, I think that the usual thing applies for our show, right? Like, just go and read the book. Like, there's a lot of good stuff in here that we just can't cover.
Hey, it won't take you long.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a day at max. Yeah.
But the next one then is product platforms. Is kind of your like Zipcar and Spotify, right? Where they're leasing out some kind of a product and taking a rent off of it. Which is kind of, there's an interesting touch point here for the history of it, that like this is kind of an effective wage stagnation, right? That like big ticket purchases are kind of out of reach for a lot of people. And so I suppose essentially paying the $10 to Spotify every month is a great substitute for like, you know, getting a decent hi-fi and enough living space to have a CD collection, you know?
Yeah, the only issue I had with that section was that it seemed a little ahistorical, because he talks about how like the music industry had a profitability crisis because people were pirating so much music. And then the answer to that was to come up with these product platforms like Spotify, where you're getting a catalog and you can get, you know, on-demand access to it. That's all true, but
a lot happened.
You know, you would think
points.
if it's because of immiseration that people went to piracy, they would just stay on piracy, where it's free, instead of going to Spotify where you're paying $10 a month.
What's being ignored there is like the extreme transnationally coordinated efforts by of repressive state activity, right? Like my students, they've never torrented anything, right? Like
they're missing out,
and so it's. Well, like, yeah, but they're also not missing out on the VPN fees that I now pay monthly, right? So, but the point being is, like, I eventually have to go to a VPN because I'm getting too many letters from Sony and HBO's lawyers. Like, but when that technology took off, like the amount of like punitive lawsuits, raiding servers, the Pirate Bay's pretty much the last of these guys are around. It goes down, it comes back up. They're constantly, people are going to prison for long periods of time. So like a huge amount of state repression becomes involved to make these properties that are about renting out access to intellectual property profitable and meaningful. And So like a carrot and stick is being offered to consumers at the same time, to the point that the average on the younger side of a millennial wouldn't even remember that there was ever a moment in which there was another option other than to go through iTunes to directly download and purchase products, or to stream off of Spotify, or to pay or to watch YouTube advertisements. That there was actually a period that still continues for a lot of internet users. There's especially before you needed a VPN because of increasing amounts of legal action, or at least the threat of potential future legal action. There's nothing cheaper than using torrents. Like Spotify is not cheaper than that. HBO Go, which I don't even have access to in Canada, isn't cheaper than that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the immiseration argument makes a certain amount of sense, but it feels like it's kind of missing the larger point, which is all the state repression and just
Well, does anyone believe that their visual media streaming service bill is going to be cheaper 5 years from now than it was 5 years ago?
Yeah, no way.
Right? Every fucking year, right? And soon you're going to need Disney's, and you're going to need Hulu, and you're going to you're going to need Amazon Prime because
it's all going in the direction of what happened with radio and cable, and and I mean, I think the important thing to point out there though is that these piracy services were depending on their own kind of network effects, right? Their convenience was based on the number of users that were using them, and those networks have become steadily drained and weakened because of the state punitive action and the massive coordinated efforts to roll out alternative catalog streaming services, on-demand services, which in turn is building its own form of network effects, right? So it's like you get a weakened network on this kind of decommodified side, and you get a strengthened network on the commodified side.
Yeah. And yeah, it's having a pretty major effect on I think a lot of us always fell back on the notion that for really obscure stuff, you'd always be able to find it on a torrent at a last resort.
Yeah,
but, that's becoming less and less true.
I don't think it's true for music anymore. Like movies, TV, but not really music.
Basically any, because even say DVD rental services, which is a form of product platform, those are all going out of business. So there are substantial swaths of cultural history that are just becoming full stop inaccessible or forgotten because the drive towards creating streaming services and catalogs and monopolizing the entire media space based on that, combined with inter-capitalist competition that leads to a product being on the service 1 year and then gone the next, and then maybe it'll come back, but then it will be gone again, right? There's no reliable library of cultural history that we can draw on, and everything is becoming more and more ephemeral. Because of that.
Netflix just removed the Legend of Korra 4 days before I finished Avatar for the first time. I'm furious.
Oh,
I want to know what happens to the Earth Kingdom, right? And now I'm never gonna know. But that shit's happening all the time, right? Especially on those platforms, and there's no. It's ephemeral, but also it drives home the extent to which. And I think this is an aspect where it's so unlike where I think most of the more even left utopian visions of early platforms and early internet culture thought, where it's actually going from a position where you are going to have the idea was the consumer or the citizen or whatever is going to have more and more control over what they get and when. Actually, we're now rapidly moving in the opposite direction because of the oligopolistic nature of these platforms. That actually, I'm going to watch whatever is on Netflix or Hulu this month. That's what I'm going to watch.
Yeah, and it's transparent to us because we've been through sort of 3 stages of this stuff, how the way in which this stuff, the mode of distribution is really very specific to the institutional forms and the profit motives that we have in our contemporary stage of capitalism. and really doesn't have to do with like the forces of production. It doesn't have to do with our technology, because absolutely, we have the technology to catalog the entirety of human cultural production and make it available. Like, we have that technology, we know, because we were almost there, right? And now, like, we see it moving in the opposite direction, and we can see that this is entirely a institutional arrangement. But like, as you were saying, Bob, in 10 years, like, younger people who are in their teens or whatever, will probably have no memory of that. In a similar way to, like, when we were growing up, we didn't remember any of the utopian promises that were made about cable distribution networks, right?
Yeah, that's right. Or FM radio. Going back, I'm reading the political economist Victor Pickard's book on media reform in the United States, in the progressive era, and it's just like, oh yeah, there was a period where people looked at FM radio. They were like, we're going to break the backs of the monopolies. Right, we're going to have access to arts and culture. We're going to remove the crass commercialization, because they were always kind of all about that stuff. And it was like, oh no, actually they just lobbied the FCC, and it's going to look exactly like the same shit, right? Like, no one would ever think that today about cable or FM radio, and now no one would think, maybe would be less likely to think that about a streaming video or streaming music or downloading music.
Yeah, there's a sort of another example as well towards the end of this section that's kind of getting away from the consumer-facing side. That apparently, like, jet engines are now not bought by airlines; they're leased by the manufacturers. So Rolls-Royce gives you a jet engine and a maintenance contract as a lease thing instead of selling it, and this is the way that they kind of ingeniously claw back some meager profit from manufacturing, which is in the doldrums, right?
So like, this is a really interesting point, because I think it is a useful example to highlight what the falling profit rate is about. Because when you think about a jet engine, like, it is an enormously expensive piece of technology, right? So you're thinking, like, how could the profit on something that expensive be so low? And the reason is because of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is that you get competitors come in, you get better production processes, and over time, your product becomes what's often called in, like, tech these days, it becomes commodified, right? Or so essentially prices decline to the level of costs, which means there's no profit, right? And so even if you're making something incredibly expensive, you have an enormous productive apparatus like Rolls-Royce to build this thing. It's like a multi-year project. You have very high salaried employees working on it. It's just this enormous undertaking. There's very little profit just because of how advanced that market is towards a declined profit rate. What Rolls-Royce did was that they said, well, we can make money on on servicing, but the problem was that people would just go to another service company. So what they did is they decided to, like, lease these jet engines at a loss in order to lock airlines into a maintenance contract with Rolls-Royce, they could then make some profit on.
And they get telemetry from the stuff, right, as well, that they can use for themselves and to optimize the process.
That's right. And doesn't it even have, like, a pithy phrase about, like isn't this, was it like, maybe I'm misremembering this, wasn't it like moving from low margin products to high margin services?
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, it's cool. So the next section then is on lean platforms. And we're talking about our kind of Uber, TaskRabbit, the grocery delivery kind of platforms. And these are, there's a couple of, the hallmarks of these platforms are that they're back to the 90s kind of like, growth before profit models. Oh, and we're talking about Airbnb as well. They're another pretty good example of this, because they have no hard assets. Their only assets are the software and the software platforms and the data analytics. So this is like mega outsourcing. Like, they're running extremely lean. Everything is outsourced or devolved in some way. And this is like that's one leg of it, right? Is that they try to hold almost no assets whatsoever, and the other leg of it is just like exploiting precarious employment and labor, right?
Yeah, it's because, you know, the capitalist, like late capitalism has absolutely fucked us as workers, and we're all desperate for even like gig jobs, right? And like, you know, in a context where access to housing becomes more and more precarious because of the kinds of monetary policy we were talking about and asset price Keynesianism we were talking about, as like, you know, housing markets become less and less affordable because of speculation, there's like a lot of room to use those unproductive speculative investments as like kind of like slum landlording through Airbnb, right? Like it's like the immiseration of workers creates spaces where these kinds of predatory businesses that are like, you know, yeah, just using the bare minimum of investment in assets and the bare minimum of staff can eke out something approaching profitability, even though they're actually not profitable, right?
Yeah, and like this is again, to go back to the kind of like the way this is presented inside of tech circles and inside the sort of valley world. This is the sort of alternative employment, sharing economy stuff, and it's really not. It's just the spearhead of a much longer term trend towards immiseration. And it's just more of the same old shit. Yeah,
and like he points out that like this is very similar to like, you know, the peace wage, right? Which like Marx in Capital says is like the most capitalistic like wage form, right? Because it's the most exploitative. So this is like, that was the common way that like wages were paid in, you know, certain like really low end manufacturing and extraction jobs in Marx's time.
The most brutal of the sweatshops in industrial England. Yeah.
Yeah, and you had like parents, you know, like peace waging out their children for work, and like there's nothing new about this at all. It's just given a fancy gloss because of the infrastructure it employs and the scope of its reach, right? Like you can get Airbnb in like just about anywhere, which is pretty impressive, but the fundamental arrangement of the enterprise is old as dirt, you know. It's as old as capitalism, at least.
Yeah. Well, I guess something that's kind of novel about it is just how fucking unprofitable these things are. Like that they're hoovering. Like, so again, like the mythology of capitalism as this dynamic force that creates, you know, that profit is its main sort of thing, and you know, but these things are just hemorrhaging money. Like, and they're being filled up with VC money. This is basically how the Saudi royal family sets all their money on fire. You know, like
yeah.
It's just a black hole in which things go in, and they're like, you would imagine that these, like, on paper, right? Oh, we're going to run as lean as possible, and we're just going to like fucking exploit as much precarious labor as possible. That kind of should be a recipe.
Sounds like it couldn't fail.
Right, but it should be a recipe for success in terms of profit, right? Like, I mean, having almost no overhead and all this kind of thing, and yet they still can't do it. But these are the figureheads of contemporary capitalism. Like, we're asked to like worship Uber as like, God, these guys are amazing. Look at this super innovative thing, and yet they still can't stick the landing. Like, it's pathetic, actually. You know, really feeble.
Yeah, because like you talk to an average Uber driver and you ask them like, you know, how are things going, and they're usually like, yeah, I'm not making enough money. I don't think I can keep doing this. Like all that kind of thing. So like that theoretical stage where Uber is going to drive out all the competition and jack up rates might not even happen just because they can't convince enough people to work for them.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, you just think of what you need to operate at a loss for the period of time that they're hoping to, you know, it's just like you need a decade of quantitative easing. You need 0% interest rates. You need a neoliberal tax regimes combined with elaborate tax avoidance strategies by massive tech companies, so that because it is now more profitable for them to invest and for the Saudis to invest in money-losing ventures that might have a chance of turning a profit in a decade than it is to invest in a corporate or government bond, because the rates the real rate of return of the yield keeps getting pushed down through quantitative easing measures, right? So this is just like the amount that a state and corporate elites have to get together in cahoots to just subsidize this massive billionaire welfare project for tech bros, for tech bro billionaires, right? And it's like you think of that in the context of people losing their having their pensions slashed and their wages slashed and right to work legislations, and it's outrageous. It gives you a sense of just how much ideological work needs to go to make these people seem like heroes and geniuses, as opposed to just a massive ripoff. Like it's just a unbelievable scam.
Well, yeah, because it's so often the sort of standard defense of capitalism is either that, oh well it works, it's like, oh, it's not ideal but it works, or like, hey look, it's this really naturalistic way of doing things, but like the amount of like as you were saying, the amount of fucking energy that goes into propping this thing up is, it's fucking incredible. Like, I mean, if something that worked naturally wouldn't need this amount of fucking work to keep it going, right?
That's right. Well, think of the classic Thatcher quote, right? Like, the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money. The problem with capitalism is eventually you run out of other people's labor.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, like, sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
Oh, well. But anyway, like, so the wrap-up for this one is that these models are likely to fall apart in the coming years. Like, I think that's, on a sober analysis, that's pretty on the money. Like, they're more and more desperate.
It's certainly the most plausible outcome.
Yeah, right? Totally. Or what's worse, right, is that they keep on going and somehow cause and effect are detached from each other, and this universe is just sort of broken.
Well, yeah, I mean, the way in which, like, the only path to profitability for these companies is like monopolization, rent extraction, very like lots. Like, I don't know if that's even viable because of just the amount of bribery that would be required to keep that monopolistic position going, and at like a global scale. Which is
what we're already seeing in China, right? Where Uber has like really serious competitors.
Yeah. Well, yeah, anywhere where there is like state sponsorship for an alternative arrangement. Uber just does not win out, right? If whether it's like, China or like, there's places in Japan where Uber is like banned from operating, right? Like, obviously they are not going to make a profit there. Or even just like, state sponsorship of some kind of like drivers cooperative, right? Like, that can also work out better. It's just the fact that like they get in there with a story of like how this is going to lead to profit, and it's all very slick, and convince municipal governments to let them in there, possibly with some bribery on the side, who knows? But
pure underpants gnome logic.
Yeah, and once they're in there and they've driven out their competitors by like exploiting their drivers to hell and back, then maybe they can turn a profit in that area. But like, again, it seems very tenuous.
Mm-hmm. Or, I mean, the more realistic one is that they'd do that, right, and then kind of immediately collapse, and then you end up with a city that has no taxi drivers anymore.
Yeah, totally.
Because they would have completely destroyed the sort of institutional basis, the ongoing basis for that kind of labor.
Yeah, and it's not like that doesn't happen all the time with capitalism, right? Just look at like that Foxconn debacle with Scott Walker, right? Like in Wisconsin, where it's just like promise the moon to like, well, it was like Walker sponsored Foxconn bringing in this factory to this town in Wisconsin, and essentially like everybody on the city council just got taken for a ride, and like it was like they were jobs promised and stuff, but like in fact like the only workers that ended up working there were like engineers from China, and like it's just like it was just, and like there was a lot of like public money that was given to Foxconn, and they just like finangled the contract like really professionally to basically cut out any kind of benefit to the local residents at all. Like, you know, this kind of like grift and like, as you were saying, Bob, this kind of grift and scamming is just like endemic at this point in time.
Yeah, though I, for one, am shocked that Foxconn would structure their contracts in an exploitive and misleading way.
Yeah, right. Like,
it seems like they're sort of. They seem like they're pretty on the level with that. I don't know.
Yeah, like
it sounds like fake news.
That's right.
Yeah, so the last chapter then is chapter 3, The Great Platform Wars, where we're going to be focusing back on competition. And one of the sort of setup ideas here is that there's a kind of a tension between, well, obviously there's a tension between monopoly and competition, right? That like the data imperative produces this tendency towards centralization and monopoly for these platforms, but there's still that classic capitalist imperative to like towards sort of disruptive competition. But like in this era, like, are we going to see a rejuvenation of capitalist competition and vitality, or a slide towards balkanized monopolies? Honestly, probably the latter. Because like the data imperative seems to outweigh that the imperatives of the previous era, which is also, I think, a sort of a neat idea, right? That like there's been a qualitative shift in the sort of structural logic of capitalism, such that the old nostrums, like, oh, you know, capitalism produces disruptive competition, might not be true anymore, or would be less true than they were, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of in a way, a sort of rehash of the monopoly capitalism argument. And again, I would always want to caution that, like, we should not overstate how competitive capitalism actually was. Because, like, again, it cannot be said enough times, but there was no golden age of capitalism, right? Not for us, not for working people, right? It did not exist, and because it is a very dangerous concept. I think this idea of competitive capitalism is a very, very dangerous concept. It is used all the time to justify faith in capitalism. That, you know, maybe we could get away from crony capitalism, monopoly capitalism, XYZ capitalism.
Though we do have periods of, maybe I'm off on this, but we do have historical periods of relative concentration and deconcentration in particular sectors and industries, don't we?
Yes, but the problem is that people listen to that, right?
Yeah, the fetishization of there was a magical period of time in which capitalism was competitive, right? Or U.S. capitalism was
small producers. You know, they were all super innovative. They were all like, you know, looking after their particular regions, and you know, that sort of neoclassical dream of a market of producers with no monopolists, where everybody is just producing for the maximal social benefit, is really trotted out a lot, both by sort of like petty bourgeois ideologues, but also by like, you know, misinformed market socialists. And so it is really, really important. I think, like, I agree with what Srnicek is saying here about like this trajectory towards monopolization, but I'm just cautioning that, like, yeah, there are relative periods of deconcentration when you have some kind of new market that opens up, and then you get something like, you know, the tech bust, and then you have massive concentration. And Marx talks about this, right? Marx talks about this in Capital.
The trajectory to monopolization is consistent and constant in any new frontier of profit, any new industry.
Yeah, it's just inherent to capitalism, full stop.
That's right. Yeah, I completely agree.
Sorry, I think I have to go to get the door. I'll be right back. Oh yeah, getting that grift podcast money. Speak of the devil, my package just got delivered by Intelcom, which is like this like delivery company, which seems to just be like outsourcing delivery to just whoever. Like it was just a dude, like no uniform, just a dude delivering. Just a dude in a Mazda just rolls up. He's like, hey man, can you help me like figure out like where room 1020 is? Because like I don't know this building. It's like wow. Lean platform.
I'll edit around this to keep that bit and to get rid of all the chaff. But yeah. That's actually quite nice. So like the next section then is kind of like getting towards the end of the book, right? Is about tendencies, right? Like where this stuff is going to go in the future. There's a tendency towards enclosure and extraction, right? Like that. I think the author presents that these platforms are just going to keep swelling and like thickening their membranes and drawing more stuff into them. So you're gonna see this expansion of Internet of Things, wearables, more sensors, drive towards like AI and more sophisticated analysis techniques. And again, like we mentioned earlier on, like this came out in 2016, and even in these two or 3 years, like this is more and more apparent, right? And it also like. This is why we can't just like demand privacy from these companies. We can't like appeal to them on the level of like values, like, Facebook needs to have better values about privacy, because there is this structural imperative towards capture, right? It's the values level of things is kind of pointless. There's a tendency towards expansion, or just expansion in general, and like especially mergers, like companies hoovering each other up in these kind of like rhizomatic mergers that just spread everywhere. And everyone's kind of getting involved in everyone else's business, right? Like suddenly every big company is getting into self-driving cars is one of the ones that jumps out, obviously. Like even Apple is getting into self-driving cars, which is fucking ridiculous. Because of this like monopolistic winner takes all sort of tendency, like you have to get involved and try to win outright. But that just means that you end up with this convergence, right? Like where you end up with like essentially 10 or 15 copies of the same company. They're all involved in the same markets. They're all half-assing every fucking sector they're involved in.
They're all trying to be involved in advertising. They're all trying to be involved in digital purchases. They're all trying to be involved in getting the next medical platform they want. Right, they can't.
Yeah, totally.
They're non-specialized, right?
Yeah, and this is the thing, right? Like, we usually think of this as like I suppose in a previous era, maybe like a tendency towards specialization and like doing your your core competencies, right? Now and outsourcing whatever you weren't actually strong at. But this is the opposite. It's a tendency towards bloated sameness, where every platform just does a poor job of serving every segment.
Which like you would think may create like a opening for firms to actually specialize on core competencies in a way that like Apple generally tries to do, right? Because they're actually their involvement as a platform company is somewhat limited compared to others. They're more of a hardware manufacturer, and like I guess you could say like a lifestyle brand or whatever. But like it's that tendency towards specialization is always going to be checked by the need to hoover up as much data as possible. So like one conceivable scenario that could come out of this is like all of these firms basically going to the state and saying, we need to work out some kind of agreement so that we can specialize on things because we're just stagnating here. Right, like it's not inconceivable that could happen, even though like using the walled garden, having the network effects is super valuable to these companies. If stagnation sets in enough, they may go to the government for like to the U.S. government or whatever, like basically like transnational capitalist state entities to work out some kind of sharing agreement so that they can overcome this tendency.
Yeah. Though it's hard to imagine something like that occurring outside of another crisis.
Oh, absolutely! Like this would be a crisis situation,
like a 2008 for big platform.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And the last section then kind of wraps up with like considerations of the future, like where this is, like two different trajectories this can go on, right? Like that we can have this like continued tendency towards these enclosures and end up with a kind of like foam of interiors that are just like completely separate from each other and in competition and trying to grab as much as possible. Or, you know, like the state can challenge these beasts, right? Like you could get public platforms as real utilities, like a public AWS or a public equivalent of Uber would be one thing. And
especially if they're not making money.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. It's like if they're not making money anyway, they need to be utilities, like public utilities. You know, a push towards post-capitalist platforms where the data isn't trapped but is used for planning. So there's a lot of potential there, like a lot of utopian futures that could fall out of that. I guess we just need to communize Uber, right? Like communize AWS.
Well, we need to communize everything, which is already kind of the issue, right?
Right. But that comes it back out into the realm of the political, right? That like this is like for so much of the calls to like to grapple with these platforms are not really in the realm of the political. They're again in that realm of values or some dumb shit like that, right? Like this is orienting us back towards like if you want to have requisite variety to challenge these monstrous beings, you need to be organized at that level, and that is a political project that kind of has nothing to do with tech.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, we've talked on this show about how tech can be a locus for worker struggle, and you know, one of the trajectories that really should focus towards is towards these becoming possibly worker owned, possibly socialized in some kind of other way, but basically like these need to stop, like especially these utilities that are the backbones of everything we rely on, they need to stop being capitalist firms. And like driving those towards some kind of communist future really is the horizon we can think about in terms of like what does a communist project mean, right? Because they're in a similar way to like, you know, how utilities were turned into co-ops in some places back in the day of, you know, like robber baron capitalism. We can think about collectivizing the platforms in a similar way, as a similar horizon for collectivization, for communization, and for socialization.
Yep, in full agreement there. I guess that's the sort of the end of the book, really. It's like the capitalist world system is in kind of incredibly bad condition at the moment, and you know, it's kind of astonishing that this is really the best it can produce. Like in terms of especially the lean platforms, right? That like completely non-profitable, in systemic risk of collapse. Like, but they're still dangerous and adaptive, right? These are still lively things that need to be challenged with equivalent power in the sort of social sphere and political sphere to get them under control.
Yeah. So I mean, I think this is like kind of a good point to say we're definitely going to be covering People's Republic of Walmart soon, and it feels like when you're talking about collectivizing these massive platforms, that's sort of the topical book of the day, so we will be talking about that more in the future.
Yeah, totally. And this has, like, I think as the listener can probably pick up, this very much resonates with us. Like, this is, you know, this is the plan for the future. Is there anything else we'd like to go over before we wrap it up?
That sounds good to me. I think that's a really good way to, other than just, I mean, it's to me, I think just really fascinating about this, talking about like communizing these platforms is I'm reminded a little bit actually of Lenin and his take on finance on Wall Street. You know, and you've got this unbelievably exploitative and oppressive apparatus that nonetheless, like, really does socialize production and the distribution of resources in these incredible ways. And I think what this book is really interesting and important is that it really just comes down to competitive competitive pressures in the matter of ownership. And these technologies are amazing. Like ride sharing technology, like Uber, could be phenomenal if it wasn't oriented upon exploiting precarious labor and squeezing as much value out of like people whose lives are already like just brutalized and like trying to make rent and working gigs. And there's a lot of interesting hope there. And so the idea that this is a political issue, and that there's something about the utopian promise of these platforms and the way they hype themselves, that's really quite fascinating. If you could find a way to turn that technology around and actually challenge the corporate ownership of these kind of what have become these monstrosities. Yep,
ownership is the key word, certainly. Yeah, well, I guess that's it for this episode. Thanks, listeners, for coming along with us, and thanks Bob, for coming along with us as
Thanks
well.
so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been great. And, as always, if you want to come on again and talk about anything else, standing offer open.
I'd love to.
Yeah. So, yeah, if you want to catch us on the internet, we're on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on the web as generalintellectunit.net, and we're on Facebook if you search for General Intellect Unit. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and maybe throwing us a couple of bucks a month. Otherwise, we give the last word to the guest. So, Bob, if there's anything you'd like to plug or anything you'd like to make the listeners aware of, where to find you on the internet and such.
Oh, I don't know if there's anything like that. At least that would be relevant to your listeners, because mostly the stuff I'm involved with is pretty local BC. But I honestly, I'd just love to thank you guys for having me on and give the opportunity to talk this through with you guys. I thought it was super enlightening and a lot of fun and a really valuable opportunity, valuable conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, it's been great, and thanks for coming. Yeah, certainly. I guess that's it for this episode, and we'll catch you again in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.